Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Peter. So Wisconsin Waterfowl Association we're a nonprofit conservation group that does habitat restoration around the state. So primarily, I'm focused on the wetland side of things, the coordinating all the projects that we do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about wetlands and just some background information. Is somebody's get cut off, I see. But basically, a large part of our program is focused on private land. And the reason being is you can see the percentages here. That's where the majority within this state of the wetlands we have lost and or are available for restoration. And wetlands, as we all know, are extremely important for a whole bunch of animals. Yes, the name of my organization is the Wisconsin Waterfowl Association, but our program has developed over the years, and we're really focused on, healthy wetlands. And so that goes for invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, birds, all those good things. What you can't really see on the bottom here is I have given credit to some of these percentages that were provided by Wisconsin Waterfowl Association. So three main things for anyone who doesn't understand what a wetland is. A wetland: hydrology, which is the water, soils, and vegetation. And we'll get a little more detailed in some of that stuff and show how they work on the landscape. So we'll talk, hydrology is really what drives everything. Hydrology is the distribution, circulation of surface and groundwater. Hydrology is what drives your vegetation response and what develops your soils over a longer period of time. It creates those characteristics within the soils. Your water, whether it's on the surface, below the surface, is really driving what types of vegetations are going to be growing there. And these are all impacted by, you can reverse hydrology, which is being impacted with your ditch fills and plugs, subsurface for drain tiles, berm breaches or construction. You might not think of berm breaches as restoring hydrology, but we have a tremendous amount of dikes and berms in the state that are in floodplains and floodways that have excluded these rivers from accessing these historic floodplain wetlands. And simply breaching these allows that influx back and forth into these wetlands that hasn't been there for, in some cases, 75 or so years. So when I'm looking at projects, project characteristics are things that would drive how we go about looking at projects and what are we going to be doing with, with wetlands and how these benefit it. So there's lots of constraints, and those are what affects how we design something, what the outcomes are. I mean, there's a whole list here. Is there drainage? Is the focus water quality? That might be different than if the focus is wildlife. One of the big things I always have to walk through with landowners is what do they want versus the restoration potential. Regulatory wise, there's constraints versus what some of these landowners may want, or what is on the land, what is the land and the wetlands showing us is available to do versus what they want. So there's things like that. And obviously we have land uses that are changing and constrain things especially as parcels get smaller and smaller. And vegetative cover really can drive, from a regulatory standpoint, what our options are. So planning starts, in the office, basically. These are all things that are readily available to anyone. You can get all this online these days. So there's plenty of sources for soils, topography. All the counties have at least 2-foot contours nowadays. A lot of them have 1-foot contours available. Your floodplains, these are all things I'm looking at ahead of time. We all should be looking ahead of time before you even go in the field to give you a good idea of when you look at something in the field, well, yeah, we can just build a berm there. Well, if you're in a floodplain, that's probably not a good idea or may not be regulatory available option. And additional info, this is one of my favorites. Those from Ozaukee County will recognize this site, I'm sure. But this is one where the county actually had drain tile maps on this site, which is very rare in most cases I have found, but it's a great additional resource. And even better is when you get these. This is probably the best handwritten drain tile map I've ever gotten from a landowner, because it has distances and depths and everything on there. So you don't have to go looking and searching and figuring all this out. But from an additional information standpoint, if you can get landowners that have been on these farms, these lands for a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, that is, from my experience, by far the best information you're ever going to get, because they can tell you what's happened over those generations and what how things have changed, and that can tell you a lot. I mean, yes, we have aerial photos for interpretation, but when you get personal hand knowledge of that stuff, it's invaluable. So one of my first questions I always ask is, how long have you owned this property or lived here or have an influence on this property? And it's amazing. I can get a year up to, well, we've been here for 3 generations. And those 3 generation ones, it's amazing. It makes my job a lot easier. Planning then moves out to the field. You know, we're looking at all the typical things, vegetation, soils, topographic surveys. As I said, you can get contours online, but really for a lot of these, you use those. I use those as a guide. We still got to do site elevations. And you're looking at all these features of drainage. What's the feasibility? Meaning, can you actually get in here? I've had projects where, is it feasible? We waited 3 years on some projects just physically to get equipment in to do because they're basically too wet. You've got to get a good frost. And this is what I'm saying, site elevations. I use my your contours that are online as a guide, but I don't need to do a full-blown topo survey of a site to figure out what's going to happen with water. I'm looking at the edges, the inholdings of private landowners, ditch cross sections, swales, things like that. You can kind of see this is about, I think this is about 50 acres here from that main east-west ditch south. And we, took points. We didn't grid the whole thing, and you can see the topo lines I generated just for fun here don't really tell me a whole lot, but my point data does. And so soils and planning, we're looking at our soils and our soil depth. This here shows, this happens to be alluvial floodplain wetland. So we have, as you can see, that top half of your picture on the right there is about 2.5 feet of sediment that's come in, and you got that stark dark line, which is the original hydric soil and also the original floodplain elevation. So back to, we just heard Matt and Andy talk about, Matt doesn't want to lose his soils, and we don't want his soils down in the wetlands, correct? Because they play huge importance. I mean, we've now taken certain points off all these pink flags and correlate them to the surface, and that gives us our ability to calculate volumes, which is cost, and also kind of where we're getting saturation, how that's going to be influenced by the removal of that kind of stuff. So now I'll dive into a lot of the kind of the on the ground practical activities that we do. Tile lines are my favorite because many times you get a pretty quick, fast response. These subsurface drainage things are extremely effective. And in the photo on the right, you see the full tile, clay tile there sitting. We're not just breaking the tile, we're physically removing the whole tile and the soil around it. And the reason being is when these have been sitting there for 75, 50 years, sometimes more, that soil is so packed around those, if you break the tile, that's the imprint of that tile is still in the soil. And that water's an amazing feature. It will run those tile lines. It'll run in that soil underneath once you break those up. So you got to really remove everything. In the bottom right is a photo in southwest Wisconsin, which is actually a calcareous fen. We ended up restoring that. This is early February with no snow on here, but we couldn't move fast enough to stay ahead of the water. We were flooding ourselves out as we started on the bottom end, and you can see the machine there kind of toward the top end. And that's how effective these things are. We had immediate surface water runoff on this site. This is an example of how they go: clay, cement, plastic, varying depths. Doesn't matter. If one doesn't work, you put another one next to it. It's kind of how some of these things work. This just gives you a good overview of sometimes you get good timing on air photos. And this is actually a Lake Michigan County. And you can see all the non-natural lines in those whitish lines through all those darker soils, or the whitish lines through the lighter brown soils are all tiles. That's all draining, the water off these sites. This is not the same site, but nearby. And so you can see here's a farm that was restored mostly in whole, and how you can put that back in the landscape. And capturing that water is hugely important for a water quality standpoint. Some things you look for when you're in the field: blowouts, failures. This one has to be a plug tile and had so much pressure it blew out like a 8-inch spring. Typically a blowout would be a big hole that's sucked the dirt right away or the soil right away, and you can fall in those up to your knees sometimes. Another example just showing how you do these. You can see these long linear lines that we've dug up. I would say that there's certain standards out there that say you only need to break tile 100 feet for certain soils, 150 for another type of soil. I'm of the mantra that break as much of it as you can, because I've been on too many sites post restoration where they've done the bare minimum standard, and it's extremely difficult to get back on site once you restore some of the hydrology. But if these things are still functioning, it's a lot harder to do. You can get by on low gradient sites with shallow tiles that are in probably lighter soils with those bare minimums, but you get heavier soils, higher gradient sites where there's higher water flows and stuff, you really want to remove as much as possible. Scrapes is just the removal of that sedimentation through years and years of erosion from whatever forces there might be. And when you get down there, you get the light brown soil, you take it off, and below it, you get that darker soil. And this is it, you know, a few months later, starting to rehydrate. Same thing here, you got, actually the berm here, the vegetation was stripped. The berm is built out of basically the sedimentation. You can see in the middle of that photo, that black original soil, and then in the lower photo, you actually see the water percolating up that was basically not getting to the surface because it was buried through so much sedimentation. This would be the vegetation. This is kind of what drives where you can and can't do work sometimes. The top left photo, obviously the high quality vegetative community. You wouldn't get a permit to work in there, you know, go do a scrape or something. But, you know, in the middle of winter or early spring on the top right, you know, this looks like it's all dead. There's nothing really there, but really you got a whole bunch of sedge meadow down here. And the picture just below it, also in the dormant season, is the same site. It's just further up in the wetland basin. And that we ended up doing, we actually did a scrape, but also removed a surface drain in there. And what was happening is the lower end had so much discharge in the water from the side hill seeps that that sedge meadow community could exist down there, but up top it was buried by about 2.5 feet of sediment. Ditch fills and plugs, they're basically what they say. Surface water drains are extremely effective. They take the surface water off the surface and funnel it away. Filling them, you know, you got to remove most of the organic stuff to get good seals on it, and so you got to pump the water out sometimes to make that work. So this photo, this diagram is actually not of a ditch plug, it's actually of a floodplain stream, but it demonstrates why and how surface drains work efficiently. The red line would be your typical soil elevation, your soil profile of the surface. Your blue line would be your water table. And you can see how as you get closer to the bottom of the ditch, the center of the ditch, that starts to angle down. And what you lose is when you restore these, or when you're losing is you have a huge area in there, can be huge depending on your soil types. You can get out, some of these in organic soils will reach out 100 feet of, you know, draining these under this, not only on the surface, but below the surface, and you lose that storage capacity, you know, between the red and blue line there. So through restoration, you're not only restoring water on the surface, but you're rehydrating all that soil in that big void right there. This just shows, if you get the right contractors, you can have some finesse with big machines. I mean, basically we just disturbed only the ditch line here and filled it in without disturbing most of the intact vegetation surrounding it. Similar thing, I am a huge proponent of using the same contractors over and over as if I can, because I've run into many cases where you can't get a contractor to just dozer down to a ditch like this, or they don't bring the right equipment to the site because they've done wetland restoration, but they haven't really done a wetland restoration. And so they more or less dug a pond or a scrape. And so finding contractors that you've used before, the right equipment, only saves me money, but also a lot of time and headaches. Other options, and I wouldn't call these true ditch fills because these would meet no standards and they would not hold any water, but it's a great way to get rid of stuff pretty effectively for a good cost. Is, you know, this would have cost us probably 20 grand or so to get rid of all the trees on this ditch line. And we put plugs in 3 spots on this ditch, and then we basically just toppled everything in for a fraction of the cost. Not only that, it provides a lot of good microhabitat for a lot of different wildlife. And this just shows, you know, there's a picture, and if you can look carefully, right along here, that's the ditch in the other photo that's been filled. And it's, you can see it looks like a berm right now. That's because we had to do it in winter because we couldn't get into the site any other time of the year. And it was then, it settled out as spring went on. That thing settled out to the point that I almost got a little concerned it was going to settle out too much, meaning you got to overfill these so you don't, what happens is these will settle down into the ditch. And if you don't overfill them just a little bit, and there's, you know, standards to follow, they basically are still a ditch. If it drops just 3 inches below your surface on the other side, you're going to start funneling water down that ditch line again. And through time, that'll kind of erode it down. So overfilling is important, but it spreads that water out. And you can see how now you have water spread across the site, and it's responded from a vegetative standpoint extremely well. Yeah, we're not just, you know, most of the time we're doing this for wildlife. And so we're pretty conscious of what we're doing, even if we don't have listed species. We're still conscious of what we're doing. So we'll let her go. And same site, actually, the day later, you know, we actually found a blinding turtle, which wasn't even known to be on that site. So paying attention does help. Embankments, berms, dikes, whatever you want to call them, they're useful in wetland restoration. I don't, you know, they're not always in the right place, but they are useful in certain areas because we have a huge issue with, quite honestly, nutrients in our wetlands and vegetation, unwanted vegetation, hybrid cattail being one of the primary ones, and reed canary grass, which are thriving on these high nutrient wetlands. And being able to manage water and being able to manage that vegetation is extremely important. That's where berms and water control structures can be extremely important. So this is the site. In fact, this is the berm in the right photo. This is what we built on that side for this 20-acre poundment. You can see it was solid cattail. I mean, there wasn't a piece of open water in there. And you can see that little line, a little ditch line running up this thing right here. And so we just built like a 2-foot berm with a water control structure. What it did is, if you look carefully in the more recent photo, there's got to be 30 or 40 muskrat houses out there, and they are naturally opening up that along with raising the water in there. A little bit artificially, don't get me wrong, but it allows it to open up, and we actually have sedge meadow and cordgrass forming along those southeast corner of the site now. There's a site you saw earlier with the disc trugs, and another thing where we put this is literally a 12-inch berm, and this was mostly where that erosion fabric is placed. Is, you know, we naturally, there was a low spot and then eroded out through time, so we just put 12 inches of dirt across there just to help kind of restore, we believe, was the natural topography. And it's amazing what these wetlands, how much acreage you can form by a simple little berm. But land use is also, this one's putting in along a roadway and tie lines. We have to reconnect some tie lines that we removed. Once we exit the wetland area, we're restoring, but then we can't flood roadways, right-of-ways, things like that. So we have to use berms and water control structures in those cases because of deferring land uses. You know, structures, they're simple things. They allow you to vegetate. I mean, here we just, the bottom right there, we simply connect it to a pipe, and that landowner will be able to flood out. If he goes in and mows those cattails, he'll be able to put enough water now over those cattails in spring that he'll be able to drown a good chunk of those out just naturally through hydrological manipulation. Plus, he's holding water on a ditch now that was just draining through his property. Floodplains a little bit. This happens to be, you know, we have a highly incised small stream here, big banks. This one happens to be southwest Wisconsin, where Topographically, we had a lot of erosion when most of our land was cleared from forest, and farming practices have gotten a lot better since then as well. Similar type of thing is just a lot of unwanted woody vegetation in this stream. And this is actually, you get, what you can't see is this was laid pre-settlement, and this is the current year. These are basically elevations of the original soil line, or surface line, I should say. And you can see in the pre-settlement one, the darker purples and blues, how much wider it is versus the modern day one on the right, how skinny it gets. That shows how in size they are. And on this project, this was a small southwestern Wisconsin trout stream that we ended up removing nearly 20,000 yards of material on probably about 50 or 60 acres. And all of that is material that had sedimented in over time. And this is the one, this is another one actually over the ridge, but this one you got some old oxbows we reconnected that have been dug straightened, or we left some unconnected as natural wildlife habitat through natural meandering. And the removal of all that is, you know, removing that dirt, and then we're peeling back those banks. And in this case, we're harvesting the desirable vegetation, really cheap and easy. And this one was done in 2012. And if you remember 2012, it was 100 degrees for all 10 days I was on this site. It was a drought, which made it work really fast and hot. But all you can see in that top photo, those are all the sedge little, I don't know, sod layers we harvested from the bank when we were dropping that whole floodplain back down. We laid them on that bank, and even in that heat, I think 95% of them survived. They're pretty resilient, and it's a really good, cheap, easy way to do it. I mean, that takes us an extra hour maybe of work with an excavator to do all that. And this is just a site post restoration. This is actually that second photo that had all the trees on the stream. This is that site 2 years later. And you can see now it's accessing its wetlands and everything through the floodplain. That's it. Thank you.
I don't know if anyone has any questions for Matt, but we're trying to set up transition. And here, Matt, I'd let you keep the microphone. And we're transitioning to a remote talk right now, so we got time. Right. Any questions?
What do you end up doing with the sucker? Where'd it go?
Well, if you know southwest Wisconsin, that's all mollusol soils, and a lot of it is, which is developed under prairies conditions. It's probably the best soil, the best black soil you will find in the state.